Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. Major developments going into the Belgian Grand Prix. The Dutch media insisting that Max Verstappen has not yet made his decision for next year and he may well still choose to leave Red Bull in the coming weeks if their performance does not improve. But the German media is heavily suggesting that George Russell's new extension with Mercedes is basically now a done deal and it's only a matter of time. The way that George Russell was speaking today in the press conferences makes that very easy to believe indeed. What actually is the truth behind this situation? Very much enjoy your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. This is kind of a cursed image, no? I don't know. Seeing anyone that isn't Christian Horner as the Red Bull team principal is kind of strange. We also maybe have a new FIA president. We'll see about this, of course, but Tim Mayer, who we know is going to be running against Ben Sulayem, he was meant to introduce his manifesto a couple of days ago. It was actually a little delayed and people were like, oh, is he actually going to launch this manifesto? Because, you know, we actually do probably want a challenger to Mohammed bin Sulayem's reign. And he has actually done that as of today, launched his manifesto and says a few words: will restore democracy in the FIA. In no institution in the world should those elected to be the watchdogs be able to be fired by the very executive they are charged with supervising, which I think is pretty much bang on the money among many other good quotes. Now, let's talk about Spa. These are some of the rear wing configurations. It's rear wing Thursday yet again here with Albert from Rega, and well, I guess you guys can't quite see that one, so let's just make sure you can. So anyway, these are the rear wings of the weekend. We'll see what the teams come up with. We know that Ferrari have a couple of different ideas that they are looking to play around with. Couple of configurations they can elect to choose because their new rear suspension may change some ideas with the way they are setting up their car. So those are the 10 rear wings here on the Thursday. And this is Ferrari's SF25 and whether it's going to be any better with the new rear suspension. Now, a couple of updates on the way that they're introducing this. They are still in the process, as of earlier this afternoon, of assembling some of the rear bodywork components that help the airflow. With this new design, Ferrari aims to reduce the tendency of the rear end to lift under braking, thereby improving stability during corner entry. Those issues were causing the SF25 to lose grip at turn-in and increasing the tendency to understeer, leading to a load of other issues. So they want to lower the rear without running the suspension too stiff to not compromise the mechanical grip. So these are the changes. You can actually see it pretty clearly here side by side. Some of the changes to the wishbone structure they have introduced for this Grand Prix. Is it going to work? That's the question. And of course today, that question was put to the drivers in the press conferences. And their answers were pretty interesting, actually. So Leclerc was asked, did you feel a difference in the behaviour, how it behaved? And Leclerc says, we didn't, and I'm not going to comment the specific behaviours of the suspensions. There was a feeling that the drivers didn't really feel much difference with the car, possibly because there were just so many variables in play. They're on a track that they've not driven with the older version of the rear suspension. They're on test demo tyres that aren't the actual ones they're going to be using. You know, multiple reasons why it'd be difficult for the drivers to really feel a major difference, but the team, apparently, the telemetry data implied that there was a benefit to the new rear suspension, but also Leclerc being very tight-lipped on what he says, and he's like, look, I'm not going to tell you anything about this new rear suspension. You're trying to get clues from me. I'm not going to say anything. I think Leclerc feels like he overshared. You remember when, I think it was Silverstone or the weekend before, when they said there was an issue they were suffering with and he didn't want to say what it was, and then there were all these rumours about the power steering, and that's come out in the press now. Fred Vasseur had to say, yeah, we do have an issue, but I don't want to comment on it. And I think Leclerc probably said that and was like, oh, we've got an issue, but I don't want to say what it is. And then, of course, the media runs rampant with it, right? So I think Leclerc might be more careful with what he says now and is basically saying, look, I'm not going to tell you anything about the suspension. It would be stupid for us to comment globally on what it actually does. Now, Hamilton was asked a few interesting things about this as well. One of it was, what do you mean test? So he was asked, how did the test go? And he was like, it was a filming day. How the car felt, it was the same. It was just a filming day. I don't know what you're talking about. Hamilton was asked a few things. This statement I thought was pretty interesting. If you look at the team for the last 20 years, they have had amazing drivers. Fernando, Kimi, of course, Raikkonen, Sebastian Vettel. But only Kimi, won a title with them in 2007. Maybe Hamilton forgot that he won a title in 2007, I don't know, or he just feels like maybe he should have won that title. But whatever you think, amazing drivers, and look, largely here he's correct anyway. And I refuse to have that happen to me. If you do the same things, you have the same results. So I am challenging everything. They are very responsive, I'm here to win, and I don't have much time. So it's crunch time, which I think is absolutely the correct attitude from Hamilton. And you're not going to pay Hamilton 100 million a year not to listen to what he has to say. So I think that's a key thing going forward. It's just interesting that Hamilton clearly very motivated still. This year, as we know, is off the table. But next year, that's the key feature, and probably one of the reasons why Hamilton is very adamant of keeping Vasseur around, because if you change Vasseur now, then surely you're almost compromising your run. Hamilton says, in the last 2 weeks, I've been at the factory for various meetings with Vasseur and Elkann, the heads of department. We've talked about the engine and also the front and rear suspensions of next year, which is very interesting for Hamilton to say specifically about the suspension design and what that might mean for next year, especially because it's been so relevant this year as well. This is a comment that he made on Horner. He says, I sat with Christian back in 2005. I wouldn't say we hit it off from the get-go, but to see his progression and his career, I think it was remarkable what he did with the team, a huge group of amazing people. Wish him all the best. To really run an organisation that big and that well takes talent and skill. That's what he brought to the team. So just, an interesting comment. He's not going to just slam the guy that's just been fired, but it is interesting because, of course, they've not shared the best relationship over the years. But if in a hypothetical world, Hamilton was told, look, we're going to sack Vasseur and fire Horner, I don't think Hamilton would be on board with that. If Hamilton had another 5 years, 10 years left in his career, he'd probably be on board. I think Hamilton, knowing that he's only probably got 2, maybe 3 more years of his career left at a push, possibly, I guess we'll see. But next year is going to be very, very telling in terms of whether Hamilton decides to stay around. He probably doesn't at Ferrari want major overhauls and changes, but I wouldn't be surprised if at some point John Elkann and Ferrari have a think about it. Now, yesterday, we heard the big rumour that Toto Wolff responded to the discussions around Max and says, we're basically going to keep George and Kimi. That's the direction of travel. That's the first priority. Everyone's up to date. Don't expect any major surprises. That was what we discussed yesterday. George then turns up, of course, at the track today and is going to be quizzed relentlessly on the topic at hand. Now, he said a few interesting things, and we'll see what Max had to say on it in a second here, but he did say emphatically the following. There is still no contract on the table, so to have something done in the space of 2 weeks isn't likely, because of course it's Spa, it's Hungary, then it's the summer break. But as I said, there's not really any rush from my side, and we'll see the full comment of Russell on that. There's not really any rush from my side, because ultimately Toto and the team will decide what they wish to do, and I will sort of be in the position to react to what they wish to do. So as I said, I'm focusing on performance, and everything else will sort itself out. I think it's in my own hands. There's no point losing sleep about it. Mercedes needs the best drivers in their race car, and I believe that I'm right up there. I don't think there's many people doing a better job, and I think he was a little bit more emphatic about this as well, and we'll see some of the full comments here in a second from Russell. Before we get back to that, Kimi Antonelli, he's not going anywhere. I never thought he would, but it really doesn't feel like he is, because he says the contract, I was never worried. And even Toto Wolff was clear, our pair works well, and we are trying to help the team to find performance. So, Antonelli becoming very media trained here all of a sudden. But the point still stands that Russell turned up today and was pretty confident in his assertions, I would say. Russell doesn't strike me as a man who's particularly fearing for his position at Mercedes. And I think he can tell that based on what's happening behind the scenes, especially if what AMUS have to say today is true, because there are various reports that can be very reliable in Formula One. Some media sources are less reliable than others. Automotor and Sport are certainly right up there, and they put out an article just a couple of hours ago talking about this situation. Now, this is what Russell said. I'm not stressed about my future. I've scored the majority of points for the team. And if you look at the facts, my job here is secure. I'm happy where I am. When I signed my last contract with Red Bull, my goal was to finish my career here. That's, of course, what Verstappen had to say. But news of, this rumour will also have reached Max. So the point that I wanted to raise is that basically, Russell was very clear today, I'm not stressed about my future, my job here is secure, and according to sources talking to AMUS today, George Russell is close to extending his contract. A breakthrough in negotiations reportedly occurred in the last few weeks between Silverstone and Spa. The Englishman himself was confident. So, despite Horner's release, the threat of departure hasn't been averted, but now it looks like he will stay. So really, that's what this article is about, discussing that as far as AMUS are concerned, Verstappen will stay at Red Bull with near certainty. Not because Max necessarily wants to stay, but purely because Mercedes may simply close the door to him, which, would be very interesting if this actually is how it transpires. As you guys know, my opinion on this has fluctuated somewhat over the months, but I've been relatively clear in my assertion that if I was Toto, I would keep the status quo. If I was me, a content creator wanting maximum drama, I would put Max and George in the car. But unfortunately, there are more sensible people maybe making the discussions, and as a result, I don't think you do that. And I also think that if you put Max and Kimi in the car, you raises questions on how good an idea that is. Not to say that Verstappen couldn't unlock more performance than George can, because as good as I think Russell is, you take Max over George, obviously, in a simple 1 versus 1, but it's not quite as simple as that. There's more complications in play. There's potential buyouts in play. There's dealing with Jos Verstappen in play. There's loads of other, complications. And if you think Russell has been performing like the best driver on the grid, and if he's not been the best driver this season, Russell, he's certainly not far away, then, there's obviously a question there about Max. As we said yesterday, in my opinion, Max has been the driver of the season. Russell has been pretty close behind. But according to AMUS, they think Russell isn't going anywhere, and therefore neither is Max. I think for Max as well, there were rumours. I mean, Dr. Obbs actually did a tweet about this, and I'll find it for you guys here in a second, about the engine for 2026, because as we know, that's a very important deal. And if Max were to leave Red Bull, he'd have to be very confident, I think, that their engine is just going to be terrible. And if he's not going to be able to go to Mercedes, which seems like the most sensible option, would he join Aston Martin in 2026, even if they would have him, even if they were to sack Stroll or Alonso to get Max? Because I think, honestly, Lawrence Stroll would do that. Like, Lawrence Stroll would not be afraid. If Max wanted to join and join now, Lawrence Stroll would make the sacrifices to make that occur. Whether that sacrifice would be Alonso more than his son, maybe that's more likely. Unfortunately for Fernando in that scenario, I wouldn't say it's impossible. Like, Toto Wolff, I think, is going to be careful about making a decision like this and make sure that it makes sense in all angles. Not to say that Max might not join next year, because he may well do. The $100 million buyout, if his contract clause doesn't come into an end in the summer break, is a big deal, right? And that could be a decisive factor. Whereas I think Aston Martin, if given the opportunity, they would simply pull the trigger on it. I just don't think that Max would want to do that. 1 more year at Red Bull just makes a little more sense. And according to Eric Van Haren, though, so he's on the other side of this. We know that he's close to the Verstappen camp in the situation at Red Bull, and he says that this is still a possibility. The contract clause is in the summer break, but there is a general move in the reporting now towards the fact that if Verstappen's contract isn't broken by a performance clause, and we think that performance clause is 4th in the championship at the summer break, he's currently 3rd, and Russell is 18 points behind him. So Russell would need to outscore Max by 19 points over the next 2 Grand Prix weekends. There is a sprint here in Spa, so it's not totally impossible. If that happens, then Russell, as I've said multiple times, may sign his own death warrant, but that's pretty unlikely. And the feeling from multiple of the reporters now is to say that, look, if his contract clause isn't broken by this clause, it's pretty unlikely Mercedes are going to spend 100 million euros to get him out of that contract, because that was the rumoured number, even if the Mercedes board is down to do it. There was another rumour that at the end of the season, if he's 3rd in the championship, then his contract is also broken, and then whatever deal Max might, finds to stay for 2027 or 2026, he may arrange something where he's able to leave slightly easier next season if he wants to go to Mercedes in 2027, for example. Totally a possibility. So I promise you this tweet here from Dr. Obbs. We know that he's pretty well connected with people at Red Bull, and he made a comment the other day to say that over the last few months he had basically heard nothing about how Red Bull powertrains were getting on, and having made that comment, he then was approached by a few new sources, and he can reveal the following. Red Bull powertrains set themselves some performance targets. They hit those targets, and their performance is not in question. Their question is about the reliability of the recovery and the deployment system. The Ford partnership is going well. They're pretty slow in building up their engine pool because there's a concern about engines that are actually going to be reliable right now. Other teams are also having issues. Certainly not the only team to be struggling with reliability. And yeah, you'd prefer a faster engine to make reliable than a slow engine that happens to be reliable most of the time anyway. But it's got to be said that Red Bull apparently, performance-wise, are pretty happy with where they are. But of course, we don't know what power unit performance targets they set themselves. Were they as aggressive as Mercedes with their targets? Maybe not. And so who really knows? The point is, it doesn't seem like a disaster at Red Bull. It's not like their engine program is a complete, absolute shambles and there's no way that it's going to work. It seems to me that it's plausible that they could do a decent job. It's probably not going to be as good as Mercedes, and it's probably not going to be especially reliable. But it might be enough to give Max a sniff, like, potentially. And that might be enough to keep Max at the team for the time being when there's no guarantee that he's going to go anywhere else and it's going to get much better. This, by the way, was Max Verstappen's press conference today. So everyone was there to pay attention to what Max had to say. Here he is sitting down with the media, all the phones are on the table, and they are quizzing him on a fair few things. Yesterday, we talked about the article with the Toto Wolff comment, but effectively suggesting this isn't happening anymore. This is happening in 2027 at the earliest. And Russell will be set to stay with Mercedes for the time being. And yeah, Van Haren went on to say, though, that internally, Max has definitely not said that he's going to stay. Verstappen hasn't said that yet, not even internally. That makes sense for several reasons. He wants to see if the team is still capable of making progress with the car. There's still a possibility he'll move to Mercedes because the contract clause is after the summer break. So that's the comment that we just saw there. You know, I would say the chances of Max leaving now are pretty slim. Like, I would put them more at maybe 20-25% rather than maybe 40% as they were previously based on the developments of the last 24 hours or so. So it seems more likely now that Russell's going to stay than it has been the case previously. Max, of course, was still saying, oh, no, I would definitely want to stay at Red Bull. I would, you know, that was my intention. That was the goal I set when I signed this deal, was to stay here until the end of my career. Don't know how likely that is anymore. He was also asked the question, is there a chance you go to Mercedes? And he said, there's also a chance I won't wake up tomorrow. Life is unpredictable. So, you know, one of the very Max Verstappen responses. He did have a few comments elsewhere, however. He was talking about Laurent Marquis, who stepped in from Racing Bulls and to lead up the team, as we know. And, I mean, well, Marco, and also I'm sure that Verstappen will have thoughts on this in due course. I think Max basically, so far, has just said, you know, he likes Marquis, he thinks it's going to be a good partnership, whatever, you know, the classic Verstappen responses. But Marco actually says that Marquis has made some changes already. That's pretty interesting, right? Because you'd think Marquis would have come in and maybe, you know, see the lay of the land before making decisions, and maybe he has done that, but it almost feels like he's come in with some ideas on the way that he can improve things immediately straight off the back, and he's changed some details in the simulator work, apparently. So, look, Christian Horner did a phenomenal job, but it was Christian Horner Racing, right? And there's probably some things that he was, you know, overlooking, and there were some insights that maybe he could have theorized. Maybe Marquis can find some elements for improvement, but still far from guaranteed in my eyes that it's going to work out in their favour in the medium term. And Eric Van Haren also went on to say that the Horner departure has no influence, and this is what Max said, on whether he's going to stay or not. So Verstappen also talked about this and says, look, I'll always maintain a good relationship with Christian. It's got no influence on whether I'm going to stay or whether I'm going to go. I didn't try and get him sacked, is pretty much what he said as well. I think the last 1.5 years have not gone how we would have liked, and management decided they wanted to steer the ship in a different direction probably, and then everyone else, of course, has to anyway agree to that and look forward. So, you know, good statement from Max, because it takes no responsibility for the decision that was made, and probably that's fair. I don't think it was exactly Max's decision, but, you know, it distances Max from the decision. He says, oh, well, you know, the last 18 months have not been how we wanted it to be, and management has decided for a change. Well, probably management with some consultation from Helmut Marko and Jos Verstappen, per our understanding, which also means that Max was very much in those discussions. So, yeah, Max is going to distance himself from the sacking of Horner, and fair enough, because I don't think Max Verstappen was the one to fire him precisely, but if Max Verstappen told the team, hey, if you sack Horner, I'm not a happy man, I'm out of here, then it wouldn't have happened, right? So it's quite clear that Max was at least on board with making this decision. He was also asked again about the Sardinia rumours. So yesterday we talked about this, and Toto Wolff said, oh, well, I don't know what you guys are talking about. We just happened to go on holiday in the same place at the same time. It is what it is. No big deal. And then people are looking at the private jet reports and seeing that his jet was in Sardinia for 5 hours, which might be conducive with a little lunch date with Toto. But, you know, Max says, whether you believe it or not, and as I said yesterday, just because the private jet was there 5 hours, it's not impossible that Max arrived on his boat and then he flew back on the jet. Who knows who was on the plane or the boat? You know, it is what it is. But Max said, I was swimming in the ocean at the time, so I don't know. Things like that don't really interest me. I was on vacation with my friends and my family. If other people are also there at the same time, that can happen, he says. So, you know, it's interesting because both of the Toto and Max, neither of them denied meeting one another. I think, you know, I will just say that. Not to say that this deal is now back on, right? Oh, Max is joining Mercedes again. But Toto could have said that, no, I didn't meet Max. I don't know what you're talking about. It's just a theory. Whereas what Toto actually said was, well, you know, sometimes we happen to holiday in the same place. And then Max says, you know, Toto just happened to be there, right? Or he didn't say Toto, but you know what I mean. He implied heavily that, yeah, maybe there was somebody else there as well, but I was just there with friends and family. So If they didn't meet one another, I would imagine that they might have said it emphatically, but maybe that's not how it is, and maybe at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter, because the latest rumour has to say that Max isn't going to be going to Mercedes anyway. But very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. You know what? I'll just look at the forecast again, because as always, it's changing all the time in Spa, in the Ardennes Forest. So, Friday, tomorrow, which is of course practice and sprint qualifying day, we're expecting some rain, maybe in the afternoon. Saturday still expected to be bone dry, but then Sunday is looking increasingly likely for some weather. I mean, like, it's certain that on Sunday there's going to be something going on. Hopefully it's not too intense. Potentially at 5 p.m. you're looking at thundery showers. So yeah, we'll see about that. But it's looking like Friday could be affected, maybe not dramatically, but Sunday almost certainly is going to be a wet race, which sounds pretty spectacular to me, if, as we know, it actually goes ahead. So very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.